Paul Conaty over here. Who's Paul Conaty?
Who is Paul Conaty? It depends on who you ask. My wife might give a different answer than other people. Paul Conaty. So I'm a Client Solutions Director. What does that mean? I work with a lot of customers talking about security and compliance. But where did I start? Maybe 23 years ago. I started in IT, Y2K updates. It means nothing to most young people these days, but that's what I started out doing. I spent probably 15 years working in security, networking, system admin, all general IT infrastructure for telcos.
Yeah, okay.
And then for the last 9 years, I've been working for CWSI in the kind of mobile space, and then branching out more and more into general cloud security and compliance kind of conversations. So yeah, that's kind of just the quick version.
Yeah. So compliance is now the thing you do on a daily basis, or
it's less maybe security and compliance, so that they're two slightly different related things.
Okay.
So a lot of what I would have done prior to this would have been focused on security, like technical controls. How do we solve a problem? How do we stop something from happening? How do we build a wall around things, or
like prevention kind of
prevention. And that's probably been the focus of most organizations. But increasingly now, we're also seeing a requirement to check that those controls are working, and that's really all compliance is. So, I like to give this example. You might notice when we do the security awareness training of at night time before you go to bed, you have locks in your house or doors, but you don't just trust that they lock themselves. You'll actually check that the locks are locked before you go to sleep.
Yeah.
And that's just you doing a compliance check that your locks are locked and maybe working, there isn't a screw loose, or someone hasn't left the window open for the cat. So that's a really simple example. So for compliance is just checking that your controls are doing what they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
At one level, that's the entry point from security. The other element is lots of organizations could have policies, internal or maybe regulations, that require them to do a set of things. Processes and controls, and compliance is just a means of making sure that those things happen.
So basically it's not like a real technical job.
No, it's less technical.
It's also related to how is the business process.
Massively so, and that's where I probably find it interesting. So obviously my background is technical, not in security, so I understand controls, the different types of things you can do, endpoints, firewalls, software security. That's
implementing the lock.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's how to build a lock and make a better lock, and a lock that works for people. But the compliance world, requires you to go talk to the business. You need to understand the requirements. So if you're a hospital, what are my requirements around managing patient records? Obviously that's confidential data, needs to be kept safe. So what's the minimum set of controls I need to put in place? And then you can go build them. But you need to understand what your minimum requirements are before you can build anything. And then the other interesting thing can be, do those policies work for the business? The simple thing is always to go too much with the security. We would say where compliance is a minimum set of standards, but you can go too far and you could potentially break a process or break something, and that could
usability break.
Absolutely, usability, or humans are a bit like water. They'll take the path of least resistance. So if you put too many barriers in their way, they'll maybe go, instead of like working the way you think they will, they'll go a different direction. Yeah. And it's very easy to do that in modern technology. So it's possible that you introduce more risk.
Yeah.
So again, compliance is looking at it in the totality. What's the outcome we want here? The outcome is we want to manage the risk. We want to make sure that our risk management controls are working.
Yeah.
So you get to talk to the business, you talk to technology, and you kind of bring it all together. So I find that interesting because, just take pure technology on its own. I'm not that kind of a nerd. I love technology, but I'm much more interested in how businesses work and why regulations are there. That's really interesting to me. Why did someone decide this regulation needed to be there? What's the risk case? What are they worried about? That I find that very, very fascinating.
So what kind of conversation or what kind of people do you talk to, finding out what their controls needed to be?
Yeah, so it's a lot of people. So initially it might be you talk to security guys, right? So or IT guys, but not so much the IT guys. Mostly security guys. But very, very quickly I find I need to talk to someone who's closer to the business. Yeah, and that can vary massively. Some security teams are really close to the business, which is really good because they have a good relationship rather than an adversarial relationship. They have a partnership relationship. That's the ideal. That's pretty rare.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, security guys are seen as a blocker or a necessary evil or something that has to be there and it gets in the way of business.
Yeah.
But also you have maybe compliance officers. Depends on the industry, depends on the organization, the size, the maturity. In a really mature organization, like in a perfect world, you would have a compliance officer. You might have a data privacy officer, very common now in Europe with GDPR.
Yeah.
And you might have a records officer, someone who's responsible for data records, not just paper anymore. Obviously, it's all data records.
Yeah.
And those kind of people live and breathe compliance. They understand it. And they're really good to talk to.
That's the ideal scenario. So
that's the ideal scenario.
I think maybe 80% or maybe less of our customers have a smaller set of people doing this kind of.
Absolutely, yeah.
So is it doable? Can you?
Yeah, actually, you can. I think it's like everything else. It's around focus. So, ultimately, what happens is what the senior management want to happen. And what we're starting to see now is because of regulation, because of fines, because of so much more visibility of breaches and the impacts of breaches, that at board level we're starting to see a lot more interest in this is a problem we need to manage.
Yeah.
And it's not just about hacking, and it's not just about the reactive or proactive security controls. It's also about the compliance side of things.
Yeah, accidental stuff maybe.
Yeah. Or insider risk is something we talk about an awful lot. You can have all the controls to stop the bad guys coming in from outside, but a potential risk is the people who are already inside. They could be disgruntled, unhappy, they could be blackmailed, coerced. All these different kind of scenarios are quite easy to imagine, and there's lots of evidence out there of these happening. Insider risk is 60-70% of breaches can be because of an insider risk. May not be malicious, it could be accidental.
Yeah.
But the point of good compliance controls then is that you can spot maybe that behavior early, or spot the activities that might indicate a problem, or at least when the problem starts, you catch it earlier and you can do damage limitation. So those are all the kind of things you might do around the compliance side of things that sits with security. They're partners.
So if you think about GDPR, 2018, I guess that
2018, May 25th, yes.
Every company was, whoa, GDPR, we need to take care of it. And basically they were trying to, screw things, down and make sure that nothing could, leak outside. But it was more because it was mandatory by law, not for because they felt it's good for my business. Yeah. Is there a difference? Is it changing that looking at
that perception?
Yeah,
that's a good question. I think the mature organisations do see benefits. The regulation is there for a reason, right? You have fire regulations on a building, right? So you have to have fire extinguishers, do fire drills, buildings have to be built a certain way because otherwise accidents and bad things happen, right?
Yeah.
So there's a reason why they're there, right? We know that modern technology hoovers up an absolute ton of data.
Yeah.
Apps on phones, will suck up contacts, will suck up your Wi-Fi information, your cellular information, potentially your location information, cookies, tracking cookies, all those sort of things.
Yeah.
Huge amount of data, particularly smartphones, because we bring them everywhere. And it could be used for all sorts of different reasons. We've seen recently things like TikTok, that there's no security issue, a hard security issue with TikTok. No one has found a piece of code that's stealing things and hacking your phone. That doesn't exist.
Still a gut feeling.
Yeah, but we do know, like there's a GDPR case against TikTok that has been adjudicated in Ireland. Interesting enough, because a lot of them are headquartered in Ireland. That they were processing data outside the boundaries of what they said they were going to do, primarily for advertising and algorithmic purposes. But they were doing stuff they shouldn't. So there's a worry because it's a hugely popular platform that they're taking this data, and because of their ownership structure and stuff like that, that it could be available to the Chinese government.
Yeah.
But we've similar problems with Facebook and WhatsApp. They could get a seizure order from someone like the NSA or the FBI, and they have to hand over their data. Microsoft had this problem before, where I think it was the FBI were asking for data from European servers. Microsoft refused to give it to them because it would have been in breach of European regulations like GDPR. So there's lots of different potential out there for data. But so organizations need to think to themselves, how do I manage that risk? What should I do? And things like GDPR help try and bring that conversation to folks. But do they believe that it's something worth doing? Not always. It does put a burden on organizations, and I think
it's not like it feels productive to be compliant.
No, if it's done properly, yes, that's not easy to do. It takes quite a lot of thinking to do that, and it's also very confusing. If you're an IT guy or a security guy, you're not a lawyer. You're not a data privacy lawyer. No. It's a very specific thing. So you need to have someone who can interpret that and come back and say, this is what we want.
Yeah.
And that's what I would do with customers. I'm not a data privacy lawyer, but I will sit with the data privacy lawyer and say, you tell me what your requirements are for this application, this data, these kind of, how do you think it should be protected?
Yeah.
And they might talk about encryption or data minimization, all these kind of things. And I'll go, okay, great. Now we'll go away and think about how that would be achieved. And then we'll think about how do we continuously monitor that that's being achieved. And that's the two sides of the security.
Well, I think if you look at it, COVID really helps us, and our, the people around us think about security, because we're working from home with more devices than ever, basically. With more applications than ever. So there's also probably something to do with that kind of way of working, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think we've all talked about it now. The old model of you worked inside a castle. You're in a nice building. It had firewalls and it had security guards and locked doors and locked cabinets to put your papers into, and everything was in a space and it was protected, and that's kind of gone now.
Yeah.
It was already starting to break out before COVID, but COVID was a massive catalyst. Now you have people literally working from home, working from trains, working from anywhere, on a much more consistent basis. Before it was maybe a small percentage of workers were doing that. The majority of people were still in the office. Now it's the other way around. It's probably 70-80% of people are remote working at least 50% of the time. And it's so they don't have all those controls anymore. You don't have a security guard saying, "Hi, Paul," because he recognizes you coming in the door, or you scan a badge so he knows you're definitely Paul, to let you inside the safe space to access the things. You don't have a computer that's on a closed network.
Is this what we mean by zero trust?
Yeah, it is a little bit, because it's before, those were the things that you validated the person. So I know you're Thierry, your badge says you're Thierry, but I also know you because you come in every day and you're sitting at a table and the other people know you. You're not a stranger. Your conversations can be kind of heard, but are in a safe space. You're on a corporate device, heavily managed, corporate network, heavily managed, much safer.
Yeah.
Now you're at home. You're on your home network. Your home network. Do you have an office? Do you have a shared house? Could you be maybe living with somebody who can hear your conversations? Could see your screen? You're on a Wi-Fi network that's probably a cheap, router that might have no security or like a default password. It's easy to compromise. Equipment, when you print out stuff at home, how do you make sure, do you lock it in a desk? Do you have a shredder? All these kind of things that you would have taken for granted in the other world.
In the office world.
In the office, and they're gone. And also everything's been done in the cloud now, so it's not even that the data is on site, it's up in someone's cloud. And then you have to think about, do I trust Microsoft? Do I trust Google? Do I trust AWS with my data? And you can, but only if you put in the controls and then make sure the controls are working. And then it's the same compliance piece. Yeah.
And it's a good job to be in? Is it always the same, or is it?
It's always different. That's why I like it. So I got into mobile from, as I said, I did 14, 15 years as a typical IT tech guy, and it was good, but it was getting a little bit repetitive. So I went to mobile because mobile looked new and interesting and shiny. iPhones, all this kind of cool stuff. I'd done BlackBerrys before, and the other thing I loved about mobile, I was always changing. Apple, Google never stopped. Every year, new features, new devices, new capabilities. It's you're always learning, always looking at something new, and then security and compliance is kind of getting to the same space now, because it's the same basic concepts, but now you have so many different types of things to think about. IoT, smartwatches, data all migrating into a cloud solution that's all built for collaboration. It's built to make it easier for people to share Identity. How do you manage identity across internal, external applications, cloud infrastructure, local infrastructure? It's complex. There's lots of moving parts, and it can be difficult to tie all that together. And a lot of the time it requires lots of different disciplines of people to come together and discuss all these different things and how to do them. And then obviously, how do I secure all that? Because it's not just about making it work, but how do I make it work in a safe way? And how do I keep it
easy way?
And an easy way. And keep it working in a safe, user-friendly way. So there's always new technologies, always new ways of doing things, new challenges. And I think it's an area that still has a huge amount of growth in it. Because as you said, most organizations are still very light. The amount of budget that gets spent on security and compliance compared to even an IT budget or compared to a general budget, it still can be single digit or quite low. And I think that will have to change, and regulation is driving that. Like we're seeing things like, we mentioned GDPR, but there's things like NIS2, which is a European infrastructure directive. So obviously we have the war in Ukraine. We've had previously hacks of like Estonian infrastructure power a couple of years ago by various external actors. So there's a recognition that national critical infrastructure needs to be better protected because everything is becoming more connected. It used to be that a lot of that stuff was enclosed networks, hardened, but that line is getting more and more blurry the way technology and the way we're enabling things is going. So the European Union is trying to put a continental-wide or EU-wide set of standards like they did with GDPR, and then local countries will interpret and to go a little bit further. So you're a bank, you're a pillar bank, you're a key insurance company, or your key healthcare hospital. Like in Ireland, we had the HSE hack last year, which was, I think, the biggest healthcare hack in the world. In terms of the damage and the level of impact. Hospitals couldn't access data.
And they're still attacking that kind of organization.
Absolutely, all the time. And then you've got obviously power, water, telcos. All those are critical infrastructure. All of them are potential targets. So I think it's to try and put a general set of standards on those, that they meet a minimum set of security standards. So that will be the first part, but then there will be a compliance layer on top. How do you continually check that you're still meeting those standards? Since the latest software update or the latest new tool has been deployed, or the new product or service has been released.
It's a process, it's not a project.
Yes, it never stops. It's always the same. It's a bit like app development. It's iterative. It's always building on what went before. So I think that's going to be a big driver now, and we'll probably put a lot more budget and focus in those kind of areas. So I think we'll see a more standardized approach over time.
About the approach, so imagine I'm a small company, maybe 50 people, working with data. I have my multi-factor authentication fixed. That's done. So I think I've got the basics right. So where do I start? What's the starting point for compliance?
Yeah, I think it's probably pretty simple, really. Like the first thing you would always start with is a risk assessment. So what do? We collect data, we process it, and we do something with it. We provide some kind of service. So what is that type of data that we collected? How do we collect it? Where do we store it? How do we process it? And what do we do after we're done processing? That's at a very simple level. That'd be the first thing you'd be thinking of. That will tell you what your risks are. So let's say
you start with documentation.
You start with documentation, but it's understanding your internal processes. A lot of organizations, maybe if you're a company that does one very simple thing, that's an easy process. But most organizations have multiple different processes, and they tend to be organic. They've evolved over time. Maybe the guy who first came up with the process doesn't work in the company anymore. We just do this way, and we don't really know why, but we know it works. Or we do it that way because we were limited by technology. And then it's, what's the data that you're looking at? Is it risky? Maybe it isn't. Then your worries are less. But maybe, let's say it's confidential data or what they call sensitive data. So, for example, HR processing is a good one. Things like knowing someone's name, address, and phone number. That's very basic. That's fine. That's a certain kind of risk.
Financial stuff.
Financial data, their banking details, or their
reviews.
Their things like religion, sexual orientation, union membership. These can all be protected classes in the data privacy, because knowledge about them is a power imbalance and could be used for bad purposes. So then you think, okay, I'm collecting some of that data. So usually the first question you ask is, do I need to collect that data? Because You're an application guy. You sometimes back in the day, if you had access to some data, you would take the data because in the future we might use it because we could do something cool with this. You know what I mean? And we don't need it now, but we could do something cool in the future. The approach now would be only take what you need, and then if you come up with a good reason to take more, well, take it, but make sure that you understand why you're taking it, what you're going to use it for, and the people who you're taking it from understand what it's being used for. So it's a different approach now. That's the data minimization principle. So I think the risk assessment is always the first place I would start, understand things, and that's just understanding your processes. And then you can kind of look and see, okay, what controls do we have? You mentioned multi-factor authentication, brilliant control. Anybody without multi-factor authentication is crazy at this point. Identity is the key entry point or key risk that most organizations have. That'd be a great place.
That's the minimum viable product.
Absolutely, MVP in the application world. I'm generally talking to customers who have things like that done, and typically they might have some endpoint stuff done and they'll have some cloud stuff done. The next thing that we tend to talk about is data loss prevention. So how do I stop data leaving my environment? So how do I stop someone, because of all the modern tools, how do I stop someone downloading or sharing data to somebody they shouldn't?
There's a lot of technology available that can prevent that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, but it's always changing. So email was a good one. There always used to be lots of tools to stop email leaving on-prem, but now your email's in the clouds. Now you use similar tools, but maybe slightly different, but they can be more powerful now, which is good. But before, when you were in your castle, maybe you couldn't take data out of the building. Now you're maybe on a laptop.
It is already out there.
You've got sharing. You've got like a share button in every single application. There's a share button because we all want to collaborate. Because we all want to enrich data. We want it to be better at what we do. How do you make sure that you only can share to the people you should share? How do you deal with contractors, third parties, all these partners? In modern companies, very few companies just work alone. They work with lots of people.
Of course.
They have to come in and get access to that data. How do you do that safely? And how do you make sure that it's that data doesn't maybe stay on their laptop when they leave? They're not working with you anymore. How do you deal with staff? Onboarding often is a big one. With the sales guy, the classic example, the sales guy leaves and he takes all the leads, contacts with him. That's something you would not want to happen.
No.
So they're all different areas. I think that. So even in a small company, after you've got multi-factor and you kind of lock down your endpoints, the next thing we typically start looking at is how do I do some basic data loss prevention. There's lots of good tools out there that would say you can't download except to trusted devices. You can't share data if it maybe only lasts for a couple of hours or until the person downloads it, and only the person's email you sent it to is the only person who can download that data. Very simple things. In mobile, stop work apps being able to share with other apps installed on the device. These are all very basic, simple controls, but still a huge amount of organizations haven't put them in place yet.
So what kind of tooling would you start with? Is it endpoint management, or is it the right document management tools? What's the architecture of what are the building blocks?
I suppose it depends where you are on the kind of maturity level. Endpoint is probably where a lot of people start after they've done identity, because it's a very easy place to understand, and there's a limited set of controls you can put in there. So most people are familiar with blocking maybe USB, so you can't plug in or pull down to USB. That's a really good control. Or can you stop uploads to Dropbox? If someone's on a different network, how do you deal with those kind of situations? That's when you start moving from endpoint into kind of cloud, CASB, proxy type controls.
CASB?
Yeah, so Cloud Access Security Broker. So these days, software is all in the cloud as a service. So you've got your Salesforces, your ServiceNows, and you need to integrate with them. So you might integrate your identity with them, and now you can log into them.
But like single sign-on.
All this good technology.
In my mailbox environment. And the same account I want to have access to in Salesforce.
But how do you then say if someone uploads a document into Salesforce that document can then be taken out of Salesforce on maybe someone who's logging in from an unmanaged machine? So how do you ensure that your controls that you have in your environment and in maybe your Microsoft or your Google environment or whatever you're using as your kind of core, your G Suite or your Office 365, how do you make sure they still exist in Salesforce, in ServiceNow, in HubSpot, and all these different tools? And that's where things like CASBs and stuff will come in, and you do some. And then after data loss prevention, the next maturity step is data classification. And sometimes I think you should do data classification first, but data classification always used to be scary. And data classification
sounds like a lot of work.
It can be, but it's definitely getting easier. So data classification is just what is my data? So this is sensitive data, this is public data, this is in between. It's not too important. If it got into the newspapers, we'd be embarrassed, but we wouldn't really worry about it.
Yeah.
This gets into the newspapers, shareholder value drops, we could be fined, that's really bad. This stuff we don't care, we'll put it on our website, we'd wear it on a t-shirt walking around town. So that could be a really simple way of classifying your data.
Yeah.
And then you might say, this confidential stuff can never leave our protected networks, our trusted devices, we never let it go anywhere.
Yeah.
This stuff in the middle, we can let it go to trusted locations, sharing partners, that kind of thing, and then public stuff, we don't really care. And that could be data classification, and that allows you to have granular data loss prevention controls, because you can get too heavy-handed on data loss prevention and just say no.
Yeah.
And that's the experience.
Yeah. But but you don't know what you don't know. So, can you scan your organization for content? Circling around and
absolutely. So this was always the challenge of data classification before. I remember doing data classification projects 15, 20 years ago, and they usually failed because it was very primitive tooling on-prem, very difficult to do, very labor intensive. In the cloud, obviously, data is tagged, it's classified almost by itself.
Or maybe AI.
Or AI, Copilot, ChatGPT, all these types of LLMs, these large language models. So, and you've got the compute resources in the cloud that you might not would have on-prem, where you take a long time to run a job or something like that. So, I do a lot of work in Office 365, for example, and there's some amazing tooling in there to be able to classify your data. And then there's third-party companies that can plug into that and kind of enhance that even further. So absolutely, before a data classification project could be a multi-year project. A medium-sized company could potentially start doing one now and get some success and get some movement in a couple of months.
So it's such a tool can just scan all your documents, will maybe find that their passport numbers or other
social security numbers,
specific
stuff.
Data in those documents, and they need to classify it, and that kind of products can.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you can start auto-classifing data, and there's some really good tooling out there.
That's a time saver.
I always give the analogy of Google Photos. I'm a big Google Photos user. I upload all my photos to it. It's my memory, and if I want to find a photo now, I don't try and remember the date or anything. I'll just type in photos of me at the beach, and I get all the photos of the beach, and then I can narrow it down to a year, and that's what I was looking for, or picture of my dog or car or a person, because you've got the facial tagging, and it's all done in the background through machine learning. I don't have to do any to do that, except maybe I can say this is a photo of Thierry, and then it automatically will know all these photos of Thierry. It will organize it for me. It's the same thing now with data. So you can start saying, this is what confidential data looks like in my organization. I'm a bank. This is what financial records look like. And you can upload maybe some examples. It goes, okay, it'll go off and look, come back and say, am I right? Is this, maybe it gets 90% right, and you might tune it a little bit more, and then you're done. But that could be 900,000 records that could be classified over a weekend.
Okay. You don't have to read it all yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So it makes it much more simple. And then once you do that, you can start doing really nice granular data loss prevention controls, and you can start to understand. So some of the tooling that we work with clients not only classifies the data, but also looks at how it's being used. So here are the documents.
Who's using it?
And why are they in different places? Why is there payroll data? It's in the payroll folder in SharePoint where you'd expect to find it. But why is it over here in some people's mailboxes? Why is it over here in maybe a Teams conversation or a personal OneDrive? There could be good reasons. Maybe it's a guy who works in payroll, or maybe it's a manager who's getting some payroll information. But it's worth looking at to understand, is it a risk or is it normal? And then you can get it to what we call a baseline. What does normal look like in my organization? Because once you understand what normal looks like, then you're only looking for anomalies, and that's much less time consuming than trying to understand everything going on all at once.
It's probably also helping you with housekeeping.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you get someone's resume sent over because someone's applying for a job, and you forget to delete it from your mailbox. This kind of technology will make sure you're compliant, because it will detect, hey, there's a resume,
a CV in the mailbox, and it's been there for a long period of time. Because we have metrics on when was the last time it was accessed, and how long has it been sitting there. So we have this idea of stale data. So that's a brilliant one, because that's not just a waste of processing space, and cloud costs money. But that's also a GDPR breach. Because if I give you my CV and you don't hire me, and you don't say to me, do you consent to me keeping your CV for 3 years in case another job comes along?
You need to move it.
Then you have to remove that CV because you've no reason to have that data anymore.
Yeah.
So that's a really good example. But yeah, the cost one is also quite good because data will proliferate in the cloud and it does cost money. So it can be a good way of cleaning out OneDrives or putting in quotas. All those kind of elements can work with compliance policies or retention policies.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So where do we start?
Where do we start? So I think if you're a typical company, and assuming that you've got some of the basics like MFA and endpoint management, the first place I'd look at starting is a conversation around data classification and DLP. And that's why I say ideally I would do one before the other. I would look at, if you understand your data, then you can do the rules. If you're just looking to put in the rules, you might go too heavy or too light. You might try to protect everything or not protect enough. I always ask, what's the crown jewels of your organization? What's the thing that if you're an application development company, where's your source code? You don't want to lose your source. Where's your secret recipe if you're Kentucky Fried Chicken? Where's your Formula One metrics for your car? Whatever the key, most important data is, start with that. And say, how should we protect that? And then you can iterate around. You don't have to do the whole company all at once. We often work with companies who say we're going to do one department, HR, finance, sales,
step by step,
product development, whoever it is, and step by step build confidence in the tooling, build confidence in the classification model, and then you can work around.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for talking.